It's a sort of bottom line, self-explanatory, end-stopping kind of word, deliberately calculated to call a halt to rational analysis. Either you see it or you don't, either you're with us or against us. Having dubbed something evil, what more or worse can you say? But it's a perilous strategy, I think, for our rulers to adopt, since if you want to beat an enemy, then of course you have to understand him at all costs. It's the only way you'll do it. So it's a self-defeating strategy, simply to dub the enemy as alien or monstrous or evil. A lesson I think that the British government took a long time to learn, but finally did learn in Northern Ireland. Evil, I suppose, there in this context means something like beyond understanding, so that, for example, analysing or explaining how Hitler rose to power would logically be to condone him. Seems a strange kind of view to take. Nobody, of course, argues that today, that argues that about the Nazis, but they do argue it about the so-called war on terrorism. My own objection to the word evil in this context is not like most leftists, I suppose, because I think evil doesn't exist. I think actually it does, and I think the word does have a specific kind of meaning, which is, for example, different from very, very bad or wicked. I hold the rather perverse view, shared by a very small minority of the human species, that there is indeed something that warrants the term evil, that various things, not just one thing, but that terrorism, or most kinds of terrorism, is not it. That terrorism is gravely wicked, if it means slaughtering innocent people, I have no doubt. But I want to reserve the use of the word evil for what some of you might think is an oddly technical kind of usage, but one which I think tells us something significant about at least certain kinds of terrorism or certain dimensions of it. Most liberals and leftists are, of course, suspicious of the word evil, aren't they, because they think that it not only describes a certain kind of immorality, but that it smuggles into its little one-word space a certain highly tendentious theory of immorality, namely that it's transcendent, a metaphysical theory, and that's why they object to it. This is unacceptable to what one might call the liberal leftist social worker theory of morality, which is that such behaviour always has discernible material causes. But these seem to me not the only alternatives. That's to say, it's not in fact a choice between what I might call the social worker theory of morality on the one hand, or a materialist theory, and a transcendental or metaphysical one on the other. You can, for example, run the two together by claiming that evil indeed has such very ordinary social and historical causes, that, for example, the faintest whiff of neglect or withdrawal of love at a very early age is enough to turn us into monsters, while also claiming that not every kind of wickedness deserves the title of evil. And I want to reserve the word evil, perhaps some people might think perversely, for this kind of autotelic, end in itself, self-causing, self-founding brand of destructiveness. An autotelism which puts it in a very sparsely populated category indeed, which includes little other than God, who, as Spinoza reminds us, is entirely self-causing and self-generating, self-grounding, and art, or at least a certain post-Enlightenment ideology of the work of art, as purely generating itself up miraculously and mysteriously from its own unfathomable depths, not dependent upon any factor outside itself, not heteronymous, but autonomous, a law unto itself, literally speaking. So I mean by evil then, for this purpose, that extremely rare condition in which we injure and destroy just for the hell of it, taking a perverse delight in human misery. Such evil is mysterious not because it conceals murky depths, but because it has the enigmatic quality of all things which are simply brutally themselves. It has the opaqueness of things that are pointless or gratuitous, beyond reason. It is not quite, what I have in mind is not quite the sort of the good old existential act gratuit of a Raskolnikov, for example, or of the man whose name I can never remember, who throws a stranger out of a railway carriage in Gide's Les Caves du Vatican, just to show that you can perform an entirely motiveless action, which of course isn't the case, because he performs the action to show that you can perform an entirely motiveless action. If you act to prove you don't have a motive, then you have a motive, all right. It's more like, I think what I'm trying to get at is more like the apparently motiveless malignity of an Iago in Shakespeare's Othello. It's certainly, what I'm not talking about is the rational, so to speak, instrumental wickedness of, say, slaughtering millions of peasants in the name of socialism. Rational here in the fairly anemic sense of the word, as fitting appropriate means to certain ends. There are, of course, deeper and richer meanings of the word rational. Notice that on this rather perverse theory, evil isn't necessarily an intensifying term. It doesn't necessarily, as I said before, mean very, very bad. Just as, for example, Thomas Aquinas believed, for curious kinds of reasons, that lying was absolutely wrong, but he didn't think that that meant it was very, very wrong. He was well aware of white lies, and probably told a few himself, whereas he didn't think, for example, that killing was absolutely wrong any more than most of us, those of us who aren't pacifists, believe that killing is absolutely wrong. Absolutely just means there can't in any circumstances be done. It doesn't indicate the degree of severity, as it were, of the deed. Breaking somebody's arm just for the thrill of hearing the bone splinter is bad, but not as bad as slaughtering millions of peasants on the wicked, if eminently rational grounds that you think they stand in the way of your political goals. Two actions belong to a different kind of category, but it's not necessarily a matter of degree. The second is clearly worse than the first. Actually, though, having said that, evil usually is very, very bad, rather than just bad, because, on the theory I'm trying to present, it involves unleashing the terrifyingly sadistic cruelty of the death drive. As, for example, in the Holocaust, which is a matter of destroying Jews and other apparently undesirable people just because of who they were, which is not quite the same thing that Stalin and Mao were up to. It's much harder, surely, to say why Hitler killed Jews than to say why Stalin killed kulaks. We know very well why Stalin killed kulaks. Nothing mysterious about that. Murdering people because they're politically incorrect or a nuisance is one thing. Exterminating them because they seem to be subhuman is another. In the end, in my view, the Holocaust was not, as some postmodernists believe, the hideous and in a way logical culmination of Enlightenment reason, because the brutality of that reason, alongside, of course, its splendid achievements that we mustn't forget about, was almost always of an instrumental kind. And the Holocaust seems not to have been that in any straightforward way. Of course, it was useful for the Nazis, like any sovereign power, to have an ideological scapegoat around the place, but you don't need to murder millions of people to have that. So on this theory, evil is indeed, in a sense, metaphysical, if you like, in a certain use of the word, in the way that just common or garden viciousness is not. Metaphysical not because it has transcendent causes, but because, like Conrad's mad professor, whom I keep coming back to in The Secret Agent, it addresses itself not just to this or that bit of reality, but as it were to reality itself, and that is a metaphysical move. What Iago finds intolerable in Othello, it seems, is not this or that action or quality of him, just the sheer scandalous fact of his very existence as apparently a good man. He has a kind of beauty in his life, Iago comments, that makes mine ugly. Othello's virtue, which of course he's highly and rather grandiosely self-conscious, is bound up with the fullness and flamboyance of his existence, all that mouth-filling rhetoric, solidity of moral character, self-conscious poeticism, and large gestured nobility of mind, all the things that make him a bit of a prig, really, as well as somebody admirable. And it's this which bugs Iago beyond endurance. It's this that he suspects, since Iago suspects that all such vividly solid pieces of being are just a sham, bogus, secretly vacuous, full of shit. And Iago's role is to reveal, to unmask this bogus, inflated, self-preening, pompous rhetoric, which he sees, as it were, not just as the speech of Othello, but as Othello's very being. So what he will do is he will implant in Othello a kind of nothing, a nameless, elusive, unbearable anxiety known as sexual jealousy, and in doing so he will hope to lay bare the true ontological negativity, as it were, which for him lurks at the root of all apparently replete, self-sufficient human existence. It's not for him a matter of opposing this or that value, because that puts you on terms with the boring sham language of morality, the language of evaluation, but showing up the very idea that anything human could have value in the first place as ludicrously self-deceptive, as a sheerly pompous sham that people indulge in, if you like, as pure ideology, as pure self-mystification. Iago only has to sniff meaning or value to feel the incurable itch to annihilate them. Like all carnivalesque jesters, he is out to deflate this solemn, overstuffed, poetically self-regarding humanity, of which Othello is an example, which is to say, I suppose, that evil of this kind is really a kind of cynicism. It's mocking, coarsely sniggering. There's elements of this in various Shakespearean clowns, not that they're evil, but vulgarly knowing, sort of smugly proud of its kind of no-flies-on-me, hard-boiled worldliness. It won't be taken in. It would rather be destroyed than taken in by the sham of meaning and value. Too streetwise to believe a thing. It greets the idea of difference, or the idea of hierarchy. That's to say, and I speak as, of course, a great defender and champion of hierarchy, one who actually has the extraordinary belief that some things are more important than others. You know, I know it's highly unfashionable these days, and I apologize for it. But the cynic treats the idea of difference or hierarchy or distinction, the idea that anything could be more precious than anything else, you know, he greets it with one long, incredulous cackle. Value is just a sentimental delusion to be sadistically shattered. That's why you're in the game, because not just you, as it were, are theoretically convinced that this is a mistake, but you derive an enormous amount of libidinal pleasure from the act of shattering and deflating, debunking this actual value. Hell is, in that sense, the death of difference. It's agonizing not because of all those wickedly sharp toasting forks, but because of its utter tedium. You know, it's a sherry party much more than a torture chamber. Like shit, hell reduces everything back to the same dreary, slimy, valueless, undifferentiated level. The problem, one problem here, is that there's a certain embarrassing sense in which the cynic is onto something. He's not wholly mistaken. It would be unlikely that such an interesting case, however appalling, you know, would just have been conjured out of nothing. I think he's onto something, because he sees, I mean, we can indeed make too much of difference and distinction and hierarchy, and ignoring the lowest common denominators, as it were, labour, suffering, sickness, the search for happiness, the search for well-being, all those things which unite us just by virtue of our material bodies, just by virtue of what Marx calls our species being, and which are so desperately out of fashion today. The problem then becomes how to be materialist in this sense without being a cynic, how to recognize the relativity of distinctions, that lots of distinctions are important but don't matter in the end, for example, while still insisting upon their worth or their necessity. William Empson has some wise words on this topic, I think, when he writes in some versions of Pastoral, I'm just paraphrasing what he says, that some people are more complex or delicate, he says, or intelligent than others, and that acknowledging that needn't matter, indeed, is a positive enrichment, but that such distinctions, he says, are in the end a poor thing compared to our common humanity. It's a case to which the champions of identity politics might well care to attend. Alongside some ancient thinkers, like I think Democritus, who said nothing was more real than nothing, supposedly, the evil believe that nothing is more real than nothing. The kind of evil I'm talking about is a form of nihilism, which is its complex relation to terrorism. The cynicism or nihilism that I've been talking about is what Milan Kundera would call a demonic kind of evil, but there's also the angelic version of it, which is very close to it, which is not too lacking in being, but too obscenely swollen with stuff. This form of evil can't stand the idea of lack, that there is non-being right at the center of us, and tries to exterminate this non-being whenever it comes across it, which of course is a self-defeating and therefore endless project, since you can't negate nothingness, you can't exterminate non-being. It finds this slimy, subversive, insidious non-being incarnate in some figure, Jew or Arab or woman, and thinks that in killing or maiming these symbolic representatives of non-being, it might just be able to cripple non-being itself, whereas in fact, as I say self-defeatingly, it's simply creating more of the stuff all the time in its very drive to annihilate it. It's a self-defeating process, which is why you have to go on until the last figure is dead, until the last figure is killed. A being which is too replete, which can't live with the fact of lack, that lack at the core of its identity, which is desire, for which one name is desire, which can't accept the scandal that it's this lack which actually makes it what it is in some respect. It's not just a contingent deficiency, but it's structural to it, tries to destroy the non-being within itself by destroying it in the guise of others, by a certain, I suppose, projection would be the standard word. But in doing so, it only deepens the vacuity within itself and drives it on in an unending process to destroy yet more being around it. Laying violent hands on others is a way of trying to murder the lack within oneself. And this, as I say, is one reason why evil is self-generating. There's logically no end to this escalating annihilation, which is a kind of Hegelian bad infinity, and which, however neurotically pure and tidy and hygienic, will always find another stray speck of meaningless matter, another homosexual, another Jew, another woman, another Arab, to purge. Because how do you know when you've destroyed nothingness? You can't really tell. In that sense, evil is a pathological form of desire, which will either, like desire, either keep going forever, there's no natural closure to it, generating itself out of its own guts, secretly in love only with itself, whatever arbitrary objects it takes up and puts down from time to time, entranced by its own motion, or it will end by consuming itself entirely. It's a stranger to limit, like the bad sublimity of bourgeois freedom I was speaking about in the first talk. It's a form of anarchic transgression, and so can see human frailty and finitude only as its enemy. And this is what makes it so implacably inhuman. But then goodness, in its insane refusal to reckon the cost, its readiness to forgive whatever the offence, is pretty inhuman too. In the end, goodness is nothing personal either, which is what the liberal finds so hard to acknowledge. If one takes these two faces of evil, so to speak, I think they provide a clue to the apparent contradictoriness of Nazi ideology, perhaps other forms of ideology too, but it's most graphic in the case of the Nazis, which on the one hand is demonic, I mean cynical, nihilistic, savagely debunking, glutted in its own orgiastic self-destructiveness, getting a thrill out of all that, and at the same time angelic, the angelic face of Nazism, full of obscenely inflated, pompous, insanely puristic and idealist, full of phony vitalism and bogus energy. The one sort of evil revels in non-being, feeds off it, leeches on it and feeds off it, the other can't bear that non-being. But what unites the two, I think, is the idea of purity. It's just that they have different views of what purity, of what counts as purity. For the demonic brand of evil, as I've been trying to argue, it's non-being, which in a sense is pure, and it's flesh and blood which contaminate it, which get in the way of it, which are always disappointing. Whereas for the angelic brand of evil, it's being, which is pure and perfected, and it's the slimy negation of non-being, in whatever political, social form it takes, which threatens to undermine it from within. The threat, of course, is as real as it is because it's not just external, it's from within. So in a way, the two then come to the same thing. There's nothing purer than an immaterial ideal, which, for example, one of the great disenchantments of Romanticism, could never possibly dream of realizing itself, because to realize itself would be to undo itself, would be to enter onto the impure region, domain of matter and history and time and change. So that ideal must be eternally incapable of realizing itself, or perhaps must, as in a certain romantic fantasy, teeter perpetually on the brink of self-realization without the fall, of actually getting what it wants or what it thinks it wants. There's nothing purer than that immaterial ideal, except for the act of destroying matter, the act of destroying human existence itself. That's the other face of it. That's pure as well. So that the highest, most angelically minded, in this sense, links hands with the lowest and most squalid. Or as I said in, I think, the first talk, the familiar bourgeois duo or couplet of cynicism and idealism together. Once again, the devil was once an angel. Purity is nothingness in two senses, in the sense that it's a radiant freedom from imperfection, and in the sense that it's a pernicious ideological delusion. Let me just end today by pointing out, to your great relief, I'm sure, that in one sense the condition I've been describing is extremely rare. You won't find many crazed anarchist professors staggering along Bloor Street with lethal rubber balls in their pocket, ready to blast themselves into eternity. At least I haven't noticed them. In another sense, however, the astonishing truth is that the extreme situation that I've been describing couldn't be more commonplace, if Freud is to be credited, because this obscene jouissance which delights in human misery is, of course, no other than our old pal, the death drive, which is unfortunately by no means confined to mad professors, staggering along Bloor Street or not. It's just a vital distinction. The human misery that we take most delight in wreaking, thankfully perhaps, is on ourselves, is usually directed towards ourselves in the form of the superego. It's when we turn this drive outwards that I think we can then begin to speak of evil without simply being garish or neo-Gothic about it. Thank you.